Live. We are live. Here we are. Um,
Hi,
hi,
Aya.
Lisa. So, welcome to the Inverted A Press channel. I don't know if I've ever spoken to you before on this channel. Have I?
I don't believe we have we? I don't
Well,
think
we
so.
might have. We might have when we were
We might
talking
have.
about books. Remember?
Yeah, we did talk about, a couple of books on here, but it was a little bit more limited, not like our regular scheduled live streams, so to speak.
Right. So, today I just want to have a casual conversation about art and literature and modern art, modern literature versus classical or romantic art and literature.
Sounds good.
What are your thoughts about modern literature?
Modern literature. Oh, I have a lot of thoughts, okay. Just reading many advanced copies for books that have come out. I used to think I really loved fiction, like historical fiction, and at one time I did, maybe up until about 2007, 8. But I feel like a lot of the newer books that have been coming out, there's just these outlandish scenarios. I get you want to write more historical fiction, but it would irritate me because they would have so many different extra characters instead of like, your book Theodosia and the Pirates. I really like that because Theodosia Burr was a real person. Jean Lafitte was a real person. But a lot of these books, they just have all these extra characters, and they will take over like establishments that a real historical person actually worked in. But they'll have this fictionalized character working there or living there, and I just feel like it's so contrived. So in historical fiction, I just felt like bombarded. Um, just too many scenarios. Like I would rather see them write about actual historical figures than make up these fictionalized people. With regular fiction, I really loved like Indian fiction. I thought it was very unique. Some of the scenarios were just different. I enjoyed that. But I really haven't enjoyed much like American fiction. Like I read a few books that were just really depressing. And there was one about this woman, like she was having an affair with this man, and her work was so beautiful, but then when the affair broke off, she felt depressed because she was with her husband again, and they went out to the country, and then she gets jealous because he starts having an affair with this girl, and it got really weird to where the young girl he's having an affair with, her dad is mad that she's not giving him enough attention, so he comes out and kills that woman's husband. It was so ridiculous. And this is people were praising this novel saying it was beautifully written, and I felt like I don't know what I read. So
Okay.
honestly, yeah, just my overview, not to be totally negative, I haven't been the biggest fan of a lot of modern literature, to be honest with you.
Okay. Now, I have a reason for just trying to pinpoint this discussion a little bit narrower. So, what about modern poetry versus more classical or romantic poetry? Do you have any opinions about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I'll be honest with you, I'm not a poet as you are. It's not my favorite genre. I do enjoy classical poetry, but my critique of modern poetry is a lot of it is just confusing. It's not very it doesn't have lyrical sense to it. I don't find it beautiful. It just seems like it's a jumbled together. I just don't find it very beautiful or well written, just in general. That's kind of
Okay,
been my observation of the modern poetry. Whereas you could read a classic poem, and yes, I would find it very beautiful.
right. Well, you see, there are actually some technical issues, that have made modern poetry less attractive to readers. I mean, it's very attractive to poets because they can write anything they want to and call it a poem. But for a reader or a listener, and actually, poetry was intended originally to be heard, not
Mm.
to be read quietly, but to be heard. And it was along the lines of the auditory arts. It was supposed to appeal to the ear. And for that reason, there was meter. The poetry traditionally was metrical.
Hmm.
And there were also rhymes. And in addition to all of that, there was very figurative speech. But that wasn't the be all and end all of poetry. The first thing was you could hear the difference between poetry and prose the same way that you can hear now the difference between music and something that isn't music, like
Yes,
music and speech, right?
yes,
Somebody's
exactly.
talking, they're not singing. And if they're singing, they're not just talking.
Yeah, there's a distinction and you know what it is. But with modern poetry, I can't say it. I don't want to offend anybody, but gibberish, like some of it, I'm just like, what am I reading? No offense, but yeah, a lot of it's just not my cup of tea. I'm not the biggest fan of poetry though, so I don't want to like critique it too harshly. It's not my favorite genre. I know you're really big into poetry. I do like classical poetry, but I never really read it to the extent that some people have, to be honest with you. I
Right.
just love history better and I love like historical fiction and art. I just never really went down the road of poetry. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And not everybody likes music either. Uh, people go to the opera or they go to concerts, but not everybody enjoys all of that. Um, of course, they enjoy it a lot more if there's a melody to the music than if there isn't a melody to the music. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I see what you're saying. And maybe too, here's another thing. Maybe I would have liked classical poetry more if I had had teachers like I mean you can teach it to yourself, but I don't feel like they understood the poetry and the meter. I don't feel like I had instructors even in college that understood that. So maybe I just wasn't that interested because they would say, let's read a poem. And they'd be like, oh, this is pretty. But then they're like, look at modern poetry. It has all this meaning. And I would read some modern poetry and I'd be like, I don't know what I just read.
Right. And to make another comparison, uh, I think a very cogent comparison to make would be uh, looking at modern visual art and classical or
Yes.
or even romantic, even the impressionists compared
I,
to the modern ones are, in my opinion, more
Oh, I love the
formal.
Impressionists because I feel like the Impressionists were actually very creative. They knew the classic techniques, but the really neat thing about them is they were trying something that was just experimental that could actually look like an image from far away, but would be a little bit rougher when you got up close. It's very beautiful. But
Yeah.
modern art, no, because okay, you can get a canvas and I don't know, like just splatter some paint on it. And depending on who you're talking to, the person can say, well, this splatter has bad meaning, and it just I'm like, no, I just don't buy it. I sorry, I don't buy most art after the Impressionist era. I'm not a big fan of any of the modern art. Period.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit in terms of two languages because I happen to know those two. I'm sure that there are other comparisons that if anybody's watching speaks a different language, might want to jump in or maybe even in the chat
Mhm.
suggest their own examples. But I think that in a way, the way that we look at art, whether it's literature or visual arts, in a language is reflected in the roots or the way that the word is built. So, for instance, do you remember when we were talking to the author Alexis P. Johnson, and she was talking about how she really likes Khalil Gibran?
Oh, I love. Yeah, he's very good. Yes, yes.
Yes, and do you recall what she said her grandfather called his poems?
What did she say specifically? Do you remember?
I think she said that before he would recite one of the poems, he would say, "I want to tell you this song," or "I'm going." It's a song.
Oh, okay. So yeah, and that makes sense because a lot of musicians actually start out as poets. So yes, that would make sense to me.
Well, yeah, and I don't speak Arabic, but I do speak Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the word for song and the word for poem is exactly the same word. So I'm guessing it might be the same for him.
It might be. And one thing, well, that I do remember about my grandfather, when he got older, he was like singing things in Arabic. He said they were songs, but maybe they were poems. I'm not really
I mean,
sure.
we have both, so I'm sure
Yeah.
he had both too. But what I'm saying is, um, you can, in Hebrew, you can sing a song, a shil shil, or you
Mhm.
can declaim a poem, which is ledaklim shil. In both cases, the word shil is either poem or song because each of them has a kind of form which is intended for your ears. It's not intended to be looked at. It's not a visual art. It's
Mm,
totally auditory,
very auditory, yeah.
and you're supposed to enjoy the beauty, not just of the meaning, but of the sound.
Hmm. And that's very important. And I think that has been lost in the modern poetry, honestly. We don't have that, do we?
We don't have it anymore, but I mean, if you look at in the 19th century, there used to be clubs of people who were not poets. They did not pretend to be poets, but they loved poetry. And what they liked to do was recite the poems. You know, when there were poems like The Highwayman, the highwayman
Oh,
came.
I know. I love some recitations of the Hyman. Very, yes.
Yes. And so people who knew that they were not poets, knew that they were not capable of coming up with a highwayman by themselves, still enjoyed the highwayman and enjoyed the art of declaiming it, of reciting it to an audience. And other people knew that they were neither poets nor actors nor reciters of poetry. And they would come to these meetings just to hear a beautiful recitation.
That would be really nice. I mean, maybe there are still people who do this. Is there anybody who still does that? I'm curious.
I don't know. I would love to start that. I mean, you know how we've had some folk sings in which
Hmm.
filkers get together and sing together online, but I suppose we could have poetry recitations too
We
online.
could, yes, yes, definitely. Now, don't ask me to recite poetry because I don't feel I'm good at that, but I would love to listen. I would love to listen to anybody we gather to do that.
Here's what I feel about myself. I like writing lyrics, but I know I can't sing. I mean, I can sing, but not like a real singer. Um, so I always get other people to sing my lyrics for me.
Hmm.
And the same way, I know my voice isn't, all that great. So if somebody else wanted to recite my poems, I'd be happy and grateful about it.
Yeah, I think that would be great. There have to be people that enjoy reciting poetry. I would try, but I just feel like I'm honest with you. I just remember that was one thing I think that made me not really love poetry was just having to get up in front of the class and not having much training in how to do that, and then being critiqued by people who didn't really understand how to recite the poetry either. That was one reason I wasn't like I might think of poem as beautiful, but I think I just had that bad memory of that, honestly.
Right. So again, just to make a comparison to visual arts, um, I think we all enjoy looking at paintings where we can tell what's in them, right? what they are of, what is being depicted. We don't necessarily have to know how the painter painted the painting. We don't have to be artists ourselves. We don't
No.
have to understand their technique or what it was, all the hard work they had to do to make that look like that. We don't have to do that, but we go to a museum or even in somebody's home when there's a painting hanging there that we like. We know what we like, right?
Oh no, definitely for sure. And I think there's a resurgence of an appreciation for older arts. Actually, one thing I've been seeing on YouTube that's really neat is there's this one woman, she painted a Victorian mural on her bedroom wall. because
Wow.
there's these people, they love retro lifestyles. Rachel Maskey, I believe. It's kind of a neat video, but yes, she sketched it out and then she painted it, and she said, I'm not going to use acrylic paint, I'm going to use house paint that she had left over. And it was a really neat little video. But just an example, people are resurrecting these arts. So yes, I think that would be neat. Maybe if you do these poetry recitings online, that's something you could do.
Yeah. Well, you know, Inverted A could sponsor such an event, and other people could come and actually do the reciting. Um, but in the same way that there's an issue with the word for poem, if you don't know what a poem is, you might think a poem is just something very obscure that nobody can understand because maybe that's how they're teaching it right now.
I think so. Yeah, honestly, I don't even feel like the teachers understand classical poetry. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I think there's very few people who teach it that understand classical poetry. That's just my honest opinion.
Right.
Because
And
I've
I'm not
actually learned more from about classical poetry from things you've told me than from English classes I took with teachers and professors. Honestly, that's the truth. Okay.
Well, I would like to start a series in which we do discuss meter and metrical poetry, and also translating metrical poetry. But you know, that's for a later date. Right now, what I'm saying is, uh, think about the word painting. What does that tell you? Well, it's obviously from paint. So
Mhm.
if right now the modern painters, they'll say, how is this not a painting? You know, because a lot of times somebody naive might come up to them and say, this isn't really a painting, that's just a bunch of splattered paint. um, and the painter will say, well, what do you think a painting is? A painting is somebody expressing himself by putting paint on a surface like a canvas or a wall or some other surface. And if you look at the etymology of painting in English, it kind of does seem that way. So that anybody can claim that what he does is, you know, I paint. So I'm a painter. So this is a painting. Um, but interestingly enough, in Hebrew, we don't focus on paint at all when we talk about paintings. We call them siyul, siyulim, plural. Um, and a siyul could be a drawing. It, you know, it could be with ink. It could be with charcoal. It could be with paint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the thing that it probably isn't would be a statue. It's not a statue because Seoul is two-dimensional.
Okay, seal.
Yeah. And so you can ask yourself, well, how do we get this word? What's
That's a
the
good. Yeah. What's origin?
Yeah, it's a little bit kind of tricky because this root is a hollow root. So sometimes it has a yud in the middle and sometimes a vav in the middle. But the word sula, which is from the same root,
Hmm.
means form. Okay.
Okay.
And the word seal, well, it means a lot of things, but it can mean axis. So in Hebrew, what we think about when we think about seal is representing something, a form of some sort, usually in only two dimensions, even though in reality there are three. Well,
Yes. Yeah, but it's two-dimensional representational, so that makes sense to me, as opposed to just like I splattered paint everywhere. Well, here's another analogy. It might offend people. Well, anybody can scribble with crayons, but that doesn't mean that it's art. Like, and I'm not trying to be mean, but the meaning that we give to art in the modern time is the meaning that a certain group of people have attributed to it, in my opinion. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if you've read The Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand.
I haven't read that. No.
Yeah, so she talks about the motivation for devaluing art, whether that art is visual or whether it's in writing. And she did not speak specifically about poetry that much. She wasn't into poetry as much as I am. but she was certainly into novels that had a form.
Mm-hmm.
And so she talked about the form of a novel as she talked about the fact that you do have to have a plot. You can't just go meandering along and not have a form, just as when you're doing a painting, there's going to be a form there.
Of
Uh,
course, yes.
so the form of a novel, you have the beginning, you have the climax, you have the denouement, but there's a very specific form to it. And it's the form goes with the content. And the purpose is to move you and to help you figure out things about life by representing life in a more compact form.
Yes. It has a climax, correct, and beginning, and it doesn't just have this loosey goosey-ness to it that I say a lot of modern novels have, with no form, basically.
Right. It's not just the form. There's characterization and there's a theme. And all of these things need to go together. The characterization can't be doing one thing and the theme doing something else and the plot doing something else. They all have to be wrapped up together, and helping each other along.
That's probably my frustration with that novel I was telling you about, just when you asked me in the beginning, what's my impression of modern literature? That novel is being presented as modern literature, but it was all over the place. I don't know what it was trying to tell me. And then at the end, it was really confusing too. I was like, oh, okay, I didn't know it was going to end like that, because they just threw in another thing, and I'm like, okay.
Right. Yeah. So, one of the reasons that I've been so excited about Korean drama, do you know what it is?
It's the plot, the characterization, they all go together, and they're
Yes.
heroic. They're heroic.
Yes, absolutely. You got it. You got it. So, it's not like modern life requires us to give up on true art.
No, it doesn't. People have chosen that. They've selected that in many different ways, honestly. Like, I have a lot of takes on that. I think if you give too much of your life to following a certain brand of politics, like what is in the news, so to speak, maybe I don't want to go there, but I feel like if you just listen to what you're being told, you're not going to live a Renaissance type of life where you're interested in art, literature, many other things that could make your life much more enriched, in my opinion.
Right. Obviously, the politics goes with it. There's a reason why Hollywood does not want to give us the kind of movies we like. I
Yeah,
mean,
sure.
after all, we're consumers. If they gave us what the Koreans are giving us, don't you think we would watch it?
I think so, but I will tell you, like, when it came to Hollywood movies, when I was a kid, there were many good movies in the 80s. I would say even before that, 90s, you still had good movies. But after that, I just would be like, what is this? I'm not interested. I'm not going to pay to go see that. And honestly, every movie just became like, oh, smashing things up or just like mindless sexual. It was nothing coherent, in my opinion.
Right. So I've been enjoying the conversations like the ones with Alexis P. Johnson and with Shandor
Oh,
H.
yes, yes.
And, Shandor reviews a lot of Korean movies and series. And sometimes he says they're good, and sometimes they're not so good. But what I find interesting is he thinks that it's because the ones that are not good, they didn't work hard enough. And I'm not sure that's what it is. You can work really hard at splattering paint on a canvas.
Oh, you could. You could spend 2 years doing that if you want to. And what they tell you is if you learn classical drawing and painting, that you will become better at the technique of splattering the paint. That's what they will tell you. You can have, because they'll say, like one professor told me, well, look at the way the paint was splattered by Pollock like that. A kid couldn't do that. He had an advanced technique.
And what do you think about that? Is that true?
It's absurd. She's like, oh, he got up on a ladder. And I'm like, anybody can get up on a ladder. and pour paint or splatter paint. I could do that. I did that with my blender and the pomegranate, and it's not art. It's a mess.
Okay, I'll tell you the truth, Julia. Because I've taken an interest in visual arts lately,
Mhm.
and I'm just a beginner and I have a lot to learn. So YouTube has been showing me all sorts of things, some of them very advanced people who really I'm blown away by what they can do.
Oh,
But
I'm
it's
sure.
but it's also shown me some other odd things just because the word painting is used in so many different ways. So it's shown me what are called paint pours. Have you heard of that?
I have, and I hate those because I don't see the point. The first time I ever heard about that was when I was watching the first episode of Sex in the City, and they were kind of like actually kind of looking down on that character because they said he is a painter, but he doesn't seem to support himself. What they didn't say in the series that they actually said in the book was, oh, his parents paid for him to live in that apartment so he could paint, pour paint. So like I guess like that was my first impression of that. And I don't understand paint pouring, honestly. Just don't.
Okay, so I watched it. I tried to understand. I do try to understand other points of view. It's
Well, no,
part of
that's good. That's really good that you do.
And I think I do see something there, and that I see some people who are earnest and um, really trying to achieve something. And the thing that they're doing is they they're almost trying to create natural shapes randomly. Does that make any sense?
That makes sense. I mean, I guess that's kind of cool if that's what they're doing. I mean, that I could kind of respect if somebody's like, I'm just paint pouring to see if I get a certain shape out of it. That's cool. I guess my take on it was the people that were so avant-garde. They're like, I'm pouring paint and whatever design I create, that is just me wedding or something.
Right. Yeah. So I think in a way they're trying to reinvent the wheel. And I've even seen some of them who said, well, it didn't quite turn out the way I wanted. So I reshaped it. And you know what they're doing? They're reinventing art, you
Yeah, they're
know?
being, I guess this is considered the new cutting edge art. So maybe paint pouring is exciting to this set of people. I just really like classic art. Like I love like what the Dutch artists did where they took maybe a year to paint something. I love that. I really respect something. Or even the impressionists where they might not have taken a year, but it actually has a representation to something we see in life. And that's my love of art.
Yeah. I don't think it really matters how long it takes. I think,
No, it doesn't. I'm just like, if it looks representational, that's
yeah.
what I like. I just don't like where it's like, oh, look at this. Like, I scribbled, but my scribbling is more advanced than a 4-year-old scribbling.
Right. So that's what my thing about Chandler says. I basically agree with him, but I think he's not getting the mechanism right because a lot of those Korean shows are actually put together very quickly and with not much. Well, I'm not
Of a
going to say
budget.
not much
Yeah.
effort, but you know, it's like they have a skeletal crew. They have only one writer instead of a whole team of writers.
Yeah, they
They
don't have a union for the writers, by the way. That's another thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and the actors really work hard, but maybe they do it on the first take. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know, but one thing I got from like just the Turkish productions and also the Koreans is they will spend more hours on set than an American set would, and they will keep working on it until they get it done that day, like whatever they're shooting. It just seems like they work really hard and they're willing to put those hours in. I'm not saying American
I'm
crews don't
sure.
do that, but do you really think like $1 million paid per episode actress is going to be like, I'm going to spend, I don't know, 17? Well, look at that show, Magnificent Century. The girl that played Harem, she quit after 2 years because she got sick from how long they were shooting on the set. Like, she literally got sick.
Oh, well, that's not good. I hope the Koreans are not getting sick from what they're doing.
I
And
think they are more controlled, though, right? I think they test,
yeah,
make
yeah.
sure
No,
people.
I like the fact that, they will shoot a series and then the series is over and they don't have to have a second series and a third series of the same show. So it's like a novel in a sense. it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it's over, you
Yes,
know?
exactly. And that was the thing I really actually I did love Big Love in the beginning. I kind of thought that had a lot of potential. It was really good. It was similar to those true to life accounts of women that lived in polygamy that I've read. Very accurate, but I felt like where it lost kind of touch with reality was the third season when he starts running for office and then they shoot off his arm and one of the guys' arm, and I'm just like, oh, I really wish they wouldn't have gone there. Like some of the subplots just got kind of weird, but it was so good the
Well,
first three seasons. Yeah,
yeah, I think that the running for office thing did make a certain amount of sense because this I see it that series as a libertarian one.
well, after that, yeah, I see what you're saying. It does have that libertarian.
Could you keep talking while I go
Okay,
take
so
this?
I do see what I is saying. Like, yes, from a libertarian perspective, yes, a polygamist, if they ran for office, that would make sense. The only reason I don't super buy it is because just everything I know about that area, and a lot of people that are living in polygamy and open sight, a lot of them would never want to out themselves that way. And if you knew anything about Bill Paxton's character the first three seasons, he didn't want anybody to know he was a polygamist and he went to great lengths. Like he was very, very secretive about it. So just the third season when he decides to run for office, I'm not saying that was a bad subplot. It was a break in his character. That's my opinion on that one. But if you look at a lot of American series, I used to think they had really well written series, and I would say the late '90s on after that, it just got really dim. So, if you're watching the Korean series, I feel like they have something that you just don't find in American shows. Like, they do have a strong plot, they have characters that are interesting. Even if it's a bad guy, there's something about them that I just enjoy watching, you know?
Yeah,
So, anyway, I was just saying that I do agree with you. Bill Paxton running for office, that is a libertarian angle. The only thing that I kind of didn't like about it was the first three seasons he was so secretive, he didn't want anybody to know he was a polygamist, and then all of a sudden he changes his mind. That was just a disconnect for me. I get what you're saying, it makes a little bit more sense now when you look at it that way, but it was just like seeing his character and all the lengths he went to conceal their identity, and then all of a sudden he wants to
uh,
out his family like that. It just was like, whoa, like that's a big change in you.
yeah, but I really like that they made the distinction between the Mormon church that sold out and became mainstream versus the people who stayed with the original religion, you know?
This is true, and but a lot of people, okay, when you read books about people that live that lifestyle, there are more people that are polygamists in Utah than you would know. Even in California and Arizona, a lot of people still are. They're living in plain sight because they don't want to get in trouble with the government.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing is, for every movement, it doesn't matter what it is. It's not that I have a big thing about polygamy, but for every movement, for people to have freedom to do whatever it is they want to do, there are the
Mhm.
people who sell out, you
Yeah.
know, and people who don't.
And yeah, they did sell out in a big way. Like, how can you say you're a Mormon if you're like, oh, well, we're just going to concede to whatever the government said? And another thing, too, about that is they made these movies like in the 80s saying, oh, these men, they were so bad because they were polygamists. But when I watched like a couple movies about it, it just seemed like they were persecuting them. And I'm like, why are they going after this group of people because they're polygamists? Like,
Yeah, yeah. That's
I do feel
that's
kind of bad for them in a way. Like, I'm just like, okay, they live a different kind of lifestyle, whatever, you know?
right. Yeah. So anyway, the main point being that there's a connection between the lack of form and the lack of content in modern art and
Mhm.
modern literature. So this, you know, inverted A press has existed for a very long time. Here are some of the books that we have published.
Oh
Here's
yes,
one.
I remember that one. That was very intriguing.
Yes, and it's an English translation of what was originally in Spanish, and it's very, very interesting. It's a true story. Uh,
Yeah, it was many like little stories kind of put together. I what I found interesting, it was like if you were talking to someone. That's kind of how I felt, like an oral tradition almost in a way.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And it is a memoir of a flamenco singer. And so I highly recommend that. This one is by me, Vacuum County. Um, Again, very within the tradition of romantic literature with a plot and a structure and a theme and character development and all of that. So, um, this channel, Inverted A Press channel, we're going to start using it more to sell our books, to sell our ideas, and maybe even to offer literature classes and classes on how to write poetry.
That would be interesting, or just even maybe an introduction to poetry to people who don't really have an understanding of classical poetry. Like, I mean, you understand the basics of poetry, but a lot of people really don't. That's just a thought, you know.
Yes, and there's another thing that we're going to do, and I hope it won't put other people off, but because our founder, my father, Amnon Katz, was an Israeli, and he wrote literature in Hebrew as well as writing things in English. Uh, we are going to have some programs that are actually going to be in Hebrew.
That's actually wonderful. I think people would find that interesting. Many people are interested in knowing about languages, so that sounds very fascinating and educational.
Okay. And I don't know that we have an audience right now because this would be a good time to open up, to questions. Um, but
I
if
don't see any comments at the moment.
Yeah, if we don't, we might want to sign off now and just spread the word that we are going to start having these Inverted A Press discussions on literature and art in the future.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Julia.
Well, thank you for telling me all about it, and have a good night, Aya.
Good night, Julia.